Well, good to see all of you again. We are getting close to the end of the semester, officially in the third and final section of the class, and we are in chapter 14 in the book America Past and Present, if that's what you've been utilizing. And we're going to take chapter 14 in kind of small little bits to make it a little bit easier to understand. We have 3 more classes technically to go, and since we are now doing this all online, obviously the final night of lecture can be incorporated into the final test. So we will not have obviously a test and then a lecture that you're required to personally attend so that we can finish up the class. So the way forward, and we are going to deal today with the aftermath of America's success in its conflict with Mexico. The Mexican-American War comes to an end in February of 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And remember that it cuts Mexico in half. It increases the size of the United States by some 20%, and basically finishes the map of the lower 48 states. There will be in 1853 a purchase of some land known as the Gadsden Purchase that will add some territory into the southern part of what will be New Mexico and Arizona, and that land is purchased in case we wanted to build a railroad across that space between New Orleans and Los Angeles. But except for that, the end of the Mexican War sees the United States take on its modern shape. But of course, the other thing that it does is it adds extensive new territory to the Union. And that territory is not covered under the terms of the Missouri Compromise of 1821. Remember that all the Missouri Compromise did was deal with the Louisiana Purchase, and so this is a vast new amount of territory. Part of that territory is, of course, Texas, and all the land that Texas had claimed once it became a republic, and that land was what had been annexed by the United States in 1845, and the dispute over the borders of Texas is what had prompted the war with Mexico. But in addition to this vast amount of Texan territory, the U.S. also acquired California and what is known as the Mexican Cession, C-E-S-S-I-O-N, the Mexican Cession being what today makes up the states of New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and that whole general area right there. So New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, little pieces of Wyoming and Colorado become part of that as well. And so we've got a whole bunch of land about which the question of slavery once more will emerge. And this will not be a question that, again, is rooted, at least in the beginning, in the issue of the morality of slavery. It's still going to be a question about political power in returns to slavery. And so the first shot, really, in this debate occurred not long after the Mexican War had begun. In August of 1846, only 3 months into the conflict, a Pennsylvania congressman by the name of David Wilmot added a amendment, or a proviso, if you will, to a piece of legislation that would have authorized spending $2 million to buy California from Mexico. So this was legislation that was going to give President Polk the ability to try and shortcut the Mexican War by giving Mexico some money. Nothing is going to come of that, as we know. But this legislation shows up in the House, and remember, under the Constitution, all money bills have to start in the House, and as a consequence of this bill being brought up, Wilmot attaches this proviso that bears his name, the Wilmot Proviso, W-I-L-M-O-N-T Proviso, P-R-O-V-I-S-O, the Wilmot Proviso, which says that the U.S. would ban slavery from any territory acquired as a result of the Mexican War. And the reason, of course, that this is being put on there is that Northern Democrats, Northern Northerners in general are very unhappy with the outbreak of the Mexican War. Remember, President Polk had been elected on the slogan of 54-40 or fight, which in sense embraced national manifest destiny. We're going to annex Texas for the South, and we were going to annex the Oregon country for the North. And remember, the Oregon country goes from what is today the southern border of Oregon, just above California, all the way to the southern border of Alaska, which was owned then by the Russian Empire. And so we were going to annex the entire west coast of what is today Canada for the North. And instead of keeping the promise 54-40 or fight, Polk had compromised with Britain, and we'd split the Oregon Territory along the 49th parallel. And so Northerners are upset about that. They're upset about the continued dominance of the South in the national government and the Democratic Party. They're unhappy that President Polk, when he came into office, had continued the reductions in the tariff that had been orchestrated by Henry Clay as a way to squirm out of the nullification crisis. And so the tariff has now gone to being a pure revenue tariff instead of a protective tariff. And all of these things made up a list of grievances for Northerners. And therefore, they want to exclude slavery in these new territories because, as we had seen in the debate over Missouri, keeping slavery out of territories is going to be a blow against Southern economic power and thus Southern political power. In other words, if you can't bring slavery and cash crops into all this territory, you're not going to have a cash crop economy, which means those territories are not going to have Southern political inclinations, and they will never become slave states. And this is perceived as benefiting the North. And so the idea here is to limit the growth of Southern economic and hence political power. But Wilmot made his case not on the basis of slavery being wrong, in addition to these political arguments. He actually made his case on racial grounds. He said that these new territories should be reserved for white people, that slavery should be excluded from them so that white settlers would not have to compete with slave labor in the economy. And therefore you wanted to keep the blacks out. As Wilmot put it, the West should be for whites only. We didn't want blacks there, whether they were free or slaves. So again, we discount this notion that what the North is trying to do is stop the spread of an immoral institution. What the North is trying to do is stop the spread of an institution that gives the South economic power and political power. So obviously, this bill gets out of the House of Representatives, which remember is dominated by the North, more Northerners, so more Northern congressmen. It gets out of the House in a purely sectional vote. All but 2 Northerners voted for the bill with the Wilmot Proviso attached. All but 2 Southerners voted against it. That sends it to the Senate of the United States. And remember, in the Senate, we have 15 free states and 15 slave states at this juncture, and out of loyalty to the Democratic Party, Northern senators are going to vote with their Southern brethren, and so the bill is modified in the House. The proviso is stripped out. It's sent back to the House, where after a lot of argument it is passed again without the proviso, although the $2 million is never used in the way that had been intended. So what happens to the legislation really isn't what matters. What matters is that for the first time, the North has fired a shot against the question of slavery going into territories won as a result of the Mexican War. And so this brought the issue to a boiling point, and a lot of the same arguments that had been issued by North and South in the Great Missouri Crisis are brought forward again. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of suspicion between the two political parties. And things looked like they were going to drift out of hand very quickly. But at that point, you had a senator from Michigan by the name of Lewis Cass come forward and propose a way to finesse this problem. And what Cass suggested was that we let the settlers who move to these territories decide for themselves whether they want slavery or not. And Cass called this squatter sovereignty. A squatter is someone who goes and homesteads on land that he hasn't bought, he doesn't necessarily have legal title to. That was later changed to the much more dignified term popular sovereignty, which is the term that we will emphasize. And popular sovereignty seemed like such a wonderful, all-American, democratic solution to the problem. Why not let the people who are going to live there decide for themselves whether they want slavery or not? The freedom, choice, and we'll see who moves there. They'll make a decision. The thing about popular sovereignty, however, is that it was vague. Just when would that decision get made? Does the first person who goes there get to make it? The first 100, the first 1,000? Practically speaking, there are only two stages where such a decision could get made. At the point where you have 5,000 people in a territory, and under the Land Ordinance of 1785, once you have 5,000 people in a territory, they can create a territorial legislature, and they get limited self-government. They can begin to make some of their own laws for the territory, even though the territory is actually run by a territorial governor appointed by the president. And a territorial legislature could make laws regarding slavery. These are known as slave codes, which govern the buying and selling of slaves, the treatment of slaves, how to deal with runaway slaves, how you deal with slaves in estates and probate court, and these sorts of things. The legal framework that's really necessary to make slavery viable anywhere in which it's established. So you could let that decision be made at the territorial stage, or you could wait until you had the 60,000 people required for a territory to elect a constitutional convention, write a state constitution, and then submit that constitution to the Congress, which is the place where Congress, as long as that Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government, then is going to be approved, and the state's going to come into union. We'd seen that become a bone of contention in the Missouri crisis, but because popular sovereignty doesn't say when the decision is going to be made, both sides could simply assume that it would be made at the point that would be favorable to them. And so the South wants to make that decision early on. The South is closer to this region than the North, and that means Southerners can get there first, at least in theory, and they would control the territorial legislature. The territorial legislature could pass a slave code, allow slaves to come in, so that by the time you got to the constitutional convention stage, the statehood stage, the twig would already have been bent, the tree would have already grown, and you would be coming in as a slave state. Northerners preferred for the decision to be made at the constitutional state, where there are 60,000 people, so there are a lot more Northerners, but they're further away. This gives them time to get there. You haven't bent the twig, so the tree is not growing toward slavery, it's going toward freedom, and with the Northerners dominating through dint of superior population, then you could establish a free state. Cass didn't say when we would do this, and that ambiguity actually helps, because if everybody gets to read it in the way that's going to be helpful to them, then the argument is over. And so this debate, which had been heading toward a crisis, suddenly is no longer heading toward a crisis. And so Lewis Cass has finessed the situation. And that means that we can turn our attention to the election of 1848. And remember, we still have two political parties. We have the Democratic Party of the outgoing President Polk, who had promised to serve only one term. Keeps that promise. Remember, he dies of tuberculosis not long after leaving office. And we have the Whig Party. The Whig Party that had been born out of opposition to Andrew Jackson had elected its first president by choosing, in essence, an Andrew Jackson clone, William Henry Harrison, who unfortunately had died only a month into his term. So it's Democrats versus Whigs. And the Democrats, somewhat predictably, nominate Lewis Cass to be their candidate, and he is going to push this idea of popular sovereignty. The Whigs thinking back to the only time that they've won, realize that what the country truly still wants is Andrew Jackson. And so as they had in the election of 1840, they will do in the election of 1848 by nominating an Andrew Jackson clone. Except this time that clone is Zachary Taylor from Mississippi. He's a slaveholder, he's a Southerner, but he spent his entire life in the Army, so he has more of a nationalist instead of a regional perspective. He, of course, is the victor of the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma and Monterey and Buena Vista, and he looks like Andrew Jackson. Again, we have photography here. If you look at pictures of Taylor and Jackson and William Henry Harrison, the three men could readily be brothers. And Americans love to elect their war heroes, and Taylor was unquestionably a war hero. Old Rough and Ready is what he was called, so that's right up there with Old Tippecanoe and Old Hickory, and therefore Taylor has got the wind at his back in the election of 1848, but not so stiffly in his back that he's sure to win. There is a third party that shows up. Remember, the Liberty Party, which was the anti-slavery party, had only garnered 7,000 votes in the election of 1844, but that had been enough to flip 3 states away from Henry Clay to James K. Polk, and had led to the Democrats winning the presidency. Well, the same danger looms now for the Whigs because our old friend Martin Van Buren, who had been denied the Democratic nomination in favor of James K. Polk because he'd come out against annexing Texas. Martin Van Buren gets nominated as the candidate of a new party called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party, which is made up of disgruntled Northern Democrats, disgruntled Northern Whigs, and the remnants of the Liberty Party. And the Free Soil Party is dedicated to banning slavery in the Mexican Cession. And that is potentially going to take votes away from the Whig candidate Taylor. And so the election is very, very close. Taylor wins it, 163 electoral votes to Cass's 127. Martin Van Buren got no electoral votes. And it was a kind of a normal election. Fortunately, people saw that it didn't break down along sectional lines. The South didn't all vote for one candidate, the North didn't all vote for another. So it looked on the map like a pretty typical election. And in the sense that we're electing another Andrew Jackson clone and we're electing a war hero, it very much is kind of a standard American election. So Zachary Taylor comes into office, and he is a smart man. And he is no enemy to slavery. He comes from a slave state. He believes slavery is constitutional. He believes as long as he's president, slavery is safe. But he is also aware of the fact that he's got this potential trouble in the Mexican Cession. This popular sovereignty business might have obfuscated the issue for a little while, but Taylor is very worried that it's going to come back to life. And one of the reasons that he's particularly concerned about this is because of what's going on in California. So at the latter half of 1848, a fellow working in north central California at a place called Sutter's Mill had found something in a creek that he had not been looking for. And that something, of course, was gold. So in the same year that the Mexican War ended and all this new territory becomes part of the United States, gold is discovered in California. And that sets off the gold rush. And people come from all over the world by boat, from Europe, from Asia, to America, to California, to get rich in the gold fields or get rich selling goods and services to people mining for gold. Some people took boats from the East Coast down to the Isthmus of Panama. There was no Panama Canal, of course, at that time. That happened until the dawn of the 20th century. So they'd get off the boat, travel across the narrowest point of the Western Hemisphere, get back on a boat, go up to California. But by far, the majority of people who went to California went overland through the vast western expanses of the United States. And since they all flooded into California in 1849, they became known as the 49ers, and by the end of 1849, you're going to have 100,000 people living in California and a vibrant economy building up. And of course, everything's going to be chaotic and there's lawlessness. And it's, so you've got a situation here where order needs to be brought to California. California is wealthy and it's got a big population, and that means that it desperately needs to become a state. But if California is going to become a state, then Taylor says it makes sense for us to make the rest of the Mexican Cession a state. And the rest of the Mexican Cession is everything west, or rather east of the Rocky Mountains. So again, part of Colorado and Wyoming, all of Utah, all of Nevada, all of Arizona, all of New Mexico. All of that is known as the Mexican Cession, and it was kind of clumped together as one thing. It was all at that point called New Mexico, and New Mexico was considered a territory. And what Taylor wants to do is to fast-track statehood for New Mexico and California. Let's just skip the territorial stage here. Let's bring them both in as a state. And so California, with the modern shape that we all know, and then basically the southwestern portion of the United States as one gigantic state that would be even bigger than Texas, even if just narrowly. And if they both came in as states at a point where neither of them had slavery, you would short-circuit the whole issue of slavery in the territories. You wouldn't have to worry about popular sovereignty. And so Taylor is pushing this idea forward, and he gets both of these places to apply for statehood. Now, there's a problem with this. California held a constitutional convention. It wrote a constitution outlawing slavery, which had not existed there under Mexican rule, and it applied to come into the Union as a free state in the fall of 1849. At that point, you have 15 slave states, 15 free states. So if California comes in, you break that balance. And obviously then, if New Mexico were to join her, you would break that balance by adding yet another free state. So you'd wind up with 17 free states versus 15 slave states. And remember that with the exception of Arkansas and eventually Oklahoma, the Louisiana Purchase is all on its way to becoming free states. So the South could see in this the end of any hope that it might have of having the majority of states in the Union. However, Taylor's proposal is going to run into trouble because, first off, Southerners want to resist bringing California in as a free state, but also because the idea of making that vast amount of land known as the New Mexico Territory State just really wasn't very practical. There were not very many Americans there. There were far more former citizens of Mexico there, but even then we're only talking about 5,000 people who were not Indians. The territory was vast, underdeveloped. It did not have much in the way of resources. The only city of note was Santa Fe, which was the southern terminus of the Santa Fe Trail that ran from Missouri all the way down to what was then Santa Fe in Mexico, although Santa Fe had been claimed by Texas when its independence. Texas had never managed to occupy it. It made some efforts, but it never managed to accomplish that, and Santa Fe was not taken away from Mexico until the war with Mexico, when United States Army troops moved in and seized the place. And so the difficulty here is that without Santa Fe, New Mexico as a territory is completely unviable. It's questionable whether it's viable even with Santa Fe, but absolutely not without Santa Fe. And so the proposal to bring New Mexico into the Union is cobbled with the idea of taking land away from Texas and giving Santa Fe to this territory of New Mexico as the capital of this proposed new state. And so obviously this is something Southerners are not going to be very happy with in terms of economics and political power, but it begins to take on a different tone because there are now some Northern Democrats, people like William Seward of New York and Thurlow Weed, also of New York, who began to push for the idea of statehood for New Mexico and California, not on just a political or economic basis, but on a moral basis. And Seward gives a speech in the Congress in March of 1849, advocating closing the Mexican concession off to slavery forever, not like Wilmot had done, because closing it off would deny Southerners economic and political power, but closing it off because slavery was an evil. It was immoral. It was wrong. And although slavery is unquestionably constitutional, and Seward is willing to acknowledge that point, he refers to, quote, a higher law, unquote, a higher law than the Constitution. And in this higher law, a moral law, I think he is referring to here, slavery is wrong and it is evil, and therefore it ought to be contained and then ultimately destroyed. And Seward, who was passionate about this, knew how Southerners would react, and he basically dared them. If you disagree with it, I dare you to secede. He's essentially calling the South bluff. And of course, now we're injecting a moral component into the argument. So this is something that had not been there during the Missouri crisis, but is now there in this new crisis that is brewing and is going to become known as the crisis of 1850, because we're sliding out of 49 into 50, and that's when everything's going to come to a head. So, now it's not just a question of economics and political power that's infused into this notion of what happens with California and New Mexico. It's also a moral question, and shades of radical abolitionism here, where Seward is basically calling Southerners evil, immoral, and un-American. And we had seen how Southerners had responded to that in the nullification crisis. They weren't going to take a backseat to anybody in being good, moral, God-fearing, law-abiding, patriotic Americans. And just like during the nullification crisis, the man who led the pushback for the South was John C. Calhoun. He's old now, he's not in good health, but he is determined to extend slavery into the Mexican concession. And he has widespread support throughout the South to resist what Southerners are referring to as Northern aggression. So unlike the nullification crisis, where South Carolinians had tried to be subtle, we're nullifying a tariff. This has got nothing to do with slavery, while the underlying purpose was to prove that nullification was a useful and real political tool for an ultimate defense of slavery. This time it's all about the expansion of slavery, and so it's easy for Southerners to sort of rally together on this question. Why should the South be barred from taking its constitutionally recognized legal property into territories won by the United States in war? After all, lots of Southerners fought in that war, lots of Southerners suffered and died in that war. The tax revenues that paid for that war came equally from the South as well as the North, and in fact, you could argue far more of them came from the South, since the tariff was the primary way that the U.S. is raising money, and the trade of Southern cotton to Europe is bringing in the manufactured goods, and so, without that cash crop, the tariff revenues would not be as high. And so the South was determined that it was not going to be pushed around this time. It was going to stand pat. And several Southern states came together to attend a convention in Nashville in June of 1850, where they made a list of complaints and demands about the way that the government of the United States has been treating the South and is intending to treat the South. And it was in this context that the issue of Santa Fe really flared up, because the governor of Texas, a man named Peter Bell, wanted to send Texas militia to to occupy Santa Fe, and he asked the legislature to authorize that expedition. The Texas legislature eventually declined to do that, but the word was out that this is what Bell was intending, and President Taylor responded to that by sending U.S. Army troops to Santa Fe and telling his Secretary of War to order them to open fire on any Texans who attempted to occupy the city. The Secretary of War was a Georgian. He refused to sign that order, and so Taylor, as president, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, signed it himself. And in the context of this sort of standoff over who was going to own Santa Fe, Taylor saying that it now belonged to the territory of New Mexico, and Texas saying no, it still belongs to us. The delegates from the Nashville Convention arrived in Washington to see if they could work something out with President Taylor, and it did not go well. Although Taylor is a Southerner and he's a slaveholder, he is more a nationalist than anything else. And like Andrew Jackson, he sees himself as the personification of the United States government. He sees the Union as sacrosanct, and the federal law as paramount, and he's not going to allow the South to threaten and to bully and to ignore federal law. And so this meeting in Washington goes very, very badly. The Southerners are talking about secession if the effort to bring New Mexico and California in as free states is continued. Taylor responds that secession is unconstitutional, and that if they tried to secede, he would use military force to stop them. If they took up arms against the United States, he promised that he would hang them with less reluctance than he had hanged deserters and spies during the Mexican War. And so the two sides part, and things are worse instead of better. And it looks like the U.S. is really now headed over the falls, that the final crisis is at hand, that the crisis of 1850 is going to be the one that's going to break the Union apart. Neither Taylor nor Calhoun were willing to compromise. Neither one was going to back down. People were beginning to predict that civil war was inevitable. And then, as it had so many times before, fate intervenes to the benefit of the United States. John C. Calhoun, who was very old, died on March 31st of 1850. So Calhoun has passed away, and Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, former congressman, former senator, Mexican War hero, been wounded at the Battle of Buena Vista, where his unit, the Mississippi Rifles, had played a key role in winning the day for Taylor's army. Jefferson Davis is now the leader of the Southern Democrats, and he's willing to compromise. Taylor, on the other hand, is not, but he's going to be removed from the scene as well. So on July 4th of 1850, Taylor, as president, did all sorts of the ceremonial duties that presidents do on Independence Day. He made a lot of speeches. He attended a picnic along the banks of the Potomac, where he ate some cherries covered in cream. It's very tasty and quite refreshing on a very hot day. But unfortunately, the cherries were tainted. And President Taylor contracted salmonella, and 9 days later he was dead. So Zachary Taylor, Mexican War hero, second Whig to be elected to the presidency of the United States, dies in office, just like William Henry Harrison, the first Whig president elected as president of the United States, dies in office. So you got to feel sorry for the Whigs. They managed to win 2 elections, both times by nominating the clone of the man they hated so much. He's the reason their party existed, Andrew Jackson. Both of them former war heroes, and both of them die in office. Both of them die in office. And so Taylor is gone. And with Taylor gone, that means that his vice president, Millard Fillmore, now becomes the president. Fillmore was from New York, and like Davis, he was willing to compromise. He saw compromise as necessary to preserve the Union. More than that, Fillmore was an intense political rival in New York State with William Seward and Thurlow Weed. And Seward and Weed were the ones pushing no compromise, no deal, we must stop slavery in these territories. And so if they were against it, then Fillmore was going to be for it. So now the leaders of Northern Democrats and the leaders of Southern Democrats and Whigs are at least willing to talk about a compromise. The question is, can the emotions be calmed down? Can the way be paved for the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate to actually vote in favor of compromise? And the person who helped to sort of push that through was Daniel Webster, a very famous senator from Massachusetts, certainly no friend of slavery, but absolutely a lover of the Union. And he made an impassioned, emotional speech in the Senate in March of 1850, just before Calhoun had passed away, in which he said, hey, look, I'm not here to talk as a man from Massachusetts. I'm not here to talk as a Northerner. I'm here to talk as an American. And he makes this very eloquent plea for the two sides to come together. He says, quote, "What am I to be, an American no longer? I would rather be I would rather hear of natural blasts and mildews, of pestilence and famine, than to hear gentlemen talk of secession. No, sirs, we cannot have secession. America is humanity's last best hope. If we fail, the world is plunged into darkness, and the only way that we succeed is by holding the Union together. And all Americans must come together to hold the Union together, to keep aloft the torch of liberty that America and America alone represents in the world. And that means we have to understand one another, and we have to love one another, and we have to forgive one another, and above all else, we must compromise." And Webster's oratory really had touched souls. And with the death of Calhoun and then the death of Taylor, his spirit, his passion for holding the country together, finding a compromise, helps to make the members of the U.S. Congress receptive to the idea. So now it becomes a practical question: is there a compromise available? And of course, when you say the word compromise, especially when you say the word compromise in regards to Western territories and the issue of slavery, everybody looks in the same direction, and they look toward Henry Clay. Henry Clay is now 73 years old. He's ill, but as was to be expected, he had put forward a proposal. And Clay's proposal is known as the Omnibus Bill. The Omnibus Bill, O-M-N-I-B-U-S, Omnibus Bill. Now today, omnibus means any piece of legislation that has a lot of disparate components to it. But it has a literal meaning here in 1850, because an omnibus was a horse-drawn bus. And it was the one means of mass transportation in most cities. And omnibuses were covered with advertising, so sort of like our buses here in the 21st century. And everybody rode them. And so poor people rode them, rich people rode them, business owners and laborers owned them or rode them. And so on an omnibus, you would find a lot of people rubbing shoulders and elbows that would never come into contact with each other in any other circumstances. And thus the name omnibus actually makes a lot of sense, because the components of Clay's compromise, as laid out in the Omnibus Bill, really are kind of a bizarre mix. And so there are 5 components to the Omnibus Bill. The first of these would admit California as a free state. Why not? There are no slaves there. It's got 100,000 people already. There's all that gold. California needs to be a state. The second of them will leave New Mexico as a single territory, but with no restriction on slavery and we will let the doctrine of popular sovereignty ultimately decide whether it becomes a slave or a free territory, and then a slave or a free state. The third component of the omnibus bill, in order to make the Santa Fe Territory viable economically, we're going to give Santa Fe and the area around it to New Mexico. So it's going to be taken away from Texas. We're going to redraw the boundary of Texas to make that happen, but in exchange, the federal government is going to assume Texas debt. Texas had a $5 million debt left over from the days of the Republic. Texas is having a very hard time getting rid of that, so the U.S. government is essentially going to bribe Texas. New Mexico gets Santa Fe, Texas will get its debt paid off by the U.S. government. Then the fourth component of the omnibus bill would ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So remember, Washington, D.C. is on the banks of the Potomac. It is surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, both of which are slave states. Slavery was legal in the national capital, and that means that slaves could be bought and sold in D.C., sometimes on the street corner. This was a particular point of horror for abolitionists and Northern Whigs. They wanted to see the slave trade swept away from the national capital, and so now that's going to happen. Of course, this won't be much of an inconvenience for people who want to buy and sell slaves. They just have to get outside the city limits, and they could continue business. But symbolically, it would be a big deal. And then lastly, there's going to be a new fugitive slave law, new fugitive slave laws. Slaves, under the encouragement of radical abolitionists and aided by radical abolitionists and especially Quakers who abhorred slavery, had created something that was called the Underground Railroad. It really wasn't a railroad, it really wasn't underground, but it's a series of smuggling routes and safe houses where slaves who ran away from their masters, mostly from border states like Kentucky and Virginia and Maryland and Delaware, could be spirited north to Canada, British territory where there was no slavery. Of course, this was something that was outrageous to Southerners. Slaves were very valuable and expensive property, and they were in essence being stolen, at least as the Southerners saw it. They were angry that Northern states were doing nothing to stop this illicit activity, and so now, as part of the omnibus bill, Clay is saying we're going to strengthen these fugitive slave laws and create a federal law that will, allow federal marshals to track down and return runaway slaves. So the 5 parts of the omnibus bill. California comes in as a free state. New Mexico becomes a territory with no restriction on slavery. Popular sovereignty will ultimately decide what happens there. Part 3, Santa Fe is given to New Mexico, in exchange for which Texas basically has $5 billion debt erased. Part 4, we're going to ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And Part 5, a new federal fugitive slave law. And so there's something in here for slaveholders, there's something in here for abolitionists, there's something in here for Northerners, there's something in here for Southerners, there's something in here for people who want free states and those who hold up hope that you might get some slave states out of the Mexican Cession. So the bill, which Clay had actually kind of put together in January of 1850, doesn't come up for debate until June and July of that year. And of course, you have Taylor passing away in the middle of that debate and Fillmore coming in. He's willing to compromise. Davis is over there. He's willing to compromise. And the thing finally comes to a vote on July 31st, and it's defeated. The omnibus bill goes down to defeat. It reminds us of the package bill in Missouri, right? The first attempt to find a way out in Missouri had also failed. And the omnibus bill fails for the same reason that the Missouri package bill had failed. You had to swallow the whole thing. And there were too many men who had sworn to make no deals and no compromises. They had promised their constituents no retreat. They had painted themselves into corners, and although they recognized that compromise was necessary to save the Union, they also felt that there were parts of this compromise that were simply unacceptable, that were wrong, that were immoral, that represented retreat or breaking promises to constituents, and enough of them couldn't swallow the whole package, and therefore they voted against it, and the bill failed. And this was stunning. This was terrifying to a lot of people. Here is a compromise put together by Henry Clay, the great compromiser himself. Henry Clay, the guy who had saved the country in the Missouri crisis, the man who had crafted a new tariff to allow Jackson to get the country beyond the nullification crisis, and now a proposal by Henry Clay has failed. And if Henry Clay can't put together a workable compromise, then nobody's going to be able to do that. And this means the crisis is going to worsen. The willingness of Jefferson Davis and Millard Fillmore to compromise is going to become irrelevant, and we are going back onto the fast track toward secession and potentially civil war. But once again, fate intervenes, and a new hero rises to the occasion, and this was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, Stephen Douglas of Illinois. He's a senator. He's young. He's a man of great political talent, quite the orator. He's a young fella. He's served 5 years in the House, 2 years in the Senate, so he's in his early 40s, and he saw this whole debate over slavery as irrelevant. You know, it's really not about slavery. If you look at the Southwest, you're not going to grow cotton there, so cash crops won't be there, so slavery won't be there either. We're having this big argument about a moot issue. Geography, climate are going to keep slavery out of this. So why should we be having this fight? Let's put this slavery business to bed and get on with the real important business of the country. So Clay crafts what will ultimately be called the Compromise of 1850. So it is Henry Clay who had first proposed a compromise, the omnibus bill, that had failed. Now you have Stephen Douglas come in who proposes the compromise that's ultimately going to work, and that is known as the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 sees Douglas essentially take a page from Henry Clay's playbook in Missouri. So what had Henry Clay done in Missouri? He had a package bill, 3 components. He had to swallow the whole thing. That had proved unacceptable. It had died. Clay had come in and he'd broken the 3 pieces of the compromise into 3 separate bills, and then had gotten the 3 separate bills passed with a lot of arm twisting by the president and the political parties. Douglas is going to do the same thing with the omnibus bill. So instead of one bill with 5 parts, have to accept all of it or reject all of it, Douglas splits the legislation into 5 separate bills. 5 separate bills. One that will admit California as a free state, another that will divide the rest of the Mexican cession into 2 territories, 2, Utah and New Mexico. No restrictions about slavery. We're going to let popular sovereignty ultimately decide what happens there. Third bill that will reduce Texas to its modern shape that we all know and love so much. That gives Santa Fe to New Mexico. In exchange for losing Santa Fe and having its borders reduced, Texas is going to get $10 million, so $5 million to pay off its debt and another $5 million to do whatever it wants, so Texas is essentially being bribed. A 4th bill to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and a 5th bill creating a new federal fugitive slave law that created a class of federal marshals who could track down and arrest supposed runaway slaves. There would be federal commissions to implement it. Citizens would be obligated to assist these federal marshals, who could also take and use local jails and that sort of thing. Captured runaways would have no rights in courts. The commissions would decide whether or not they were really a runaway or they were a free person. They couldn't testify. It was really a pretty slanted system, and of course the marshals would be compensated. So if they had accidentally arrested a free black, they would be paid $5. If they had actually arrested a runaway slave, they would get paid $10. And so this is an incentive for them to arrest any black that they found, because they were going to make money. This law is going to prove to be very controversial. It's going to stir up a lot of trouble, but that is in the future. So the 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850. California, free state. You take the rest of the Mexican cession, you divide it up into 2 territories, Utah and New Mexico. Popular sovereignty will decide whether they have slavery or not. Texas takes on its modern shape. Santa Fe goes to New Mexico, and in exchange for that, Texas gets $10 million. 4th part, end of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. 5th part, new federal fugitive slave law. And each of these bills was brought to a vote separately, and just as had happened in the Missouri crisis, the political parties twisted arms. They made threats. They told people to come and vote for the things they could vote for, but to stay away on the day that things they couldn't accept were voted for. Let the pros have the advantage when the voting was taking place. And as it had in Missouri, that worked. And all 5 bills were passed. And once the last of these was passed, the country breathed a giant sigh of relief. There had been so much fear, so much dread. Secession, Civil War had looked like they were right around the corner, and now Stephen Douglas has pulled the country's chestnuts out of the fire. He's now the great hero, and a lot of people expect him eventually to become a president. The Congress, having pulled off this compromise, produces an outburst of celebration. The country went wild with joy. As one newspaper put it, quote, bonfires, processions, serenades, speeches, suppers, drinking, and cannon salutes filled the next 5 days. One paper said that it was everybody's patriotic duty to go out and get drunk, and it seemed like just about everyone in Washington, D.C., and everyone in Congress actually did that. So great was the release. The great territorial issue had been solved. You could now look at the map, and everything had been laid out. The 3630 line had declared slavery north of that demarcation banned forever, with the exception of Missouri. South of that line, slavery would be permitted. California is a free state, and the Mexican cession's been divided into New Mexico and Utah, and popular sovereignty will decide there. And did this have an impact on politics and slavery? And the answer is no. 10 years later, in 1860, there were only 29 slaves in Utah, and there wasn't a single slave in New Mexico. And although California comes into the Union as a free state, its first 2 senators are Southern sympathizers, and they vote as though they were from a slave state. And so this isn't disruptive necessarily of the balance of political power. It really does seem like the country has solved this intractable problem, and as Stephen Douglas hopes, it can get on with other things. But of course, that was not really the case. It wasn't really the case at all. The Fugitive Slave Act is going to cause trouble. The question of popular sovereignty, although it is going to not really produce any issues in New Mexico and Arizona, is going to be lifted from the Mexican cession and applied to what's left of Louisiana Purchase by Southerners. And they are therefore going to reignite the question of slavery in territories that we thought that we had solved, that we had put away once and for all. So for the moment, Stephen Douglas has helped save the Union. The issues have gone onto the back burner. The country for a few years is going to be able to think about other things, but just like an infection where you didn't take all of your penicillin and your symptoms are gone, but the disease is still there waiting for your immune system to become weaker so it can come raging back in a more virulent form, that is where the country is. We think that we've dealt with this affliction. The symptoms for the moment are gone, but the underlying problems remain, and we're just waiting for a point where we become susceptible to the argument and the debate again. And it's going to happen very quickly. By the time we get to 1853, 54, the lid is going to start to come off. And ironically, one of the people who's going to play a key role in making that happen is the savior, Stephen Douglas, who will wind up undoing everything that he accomplished in the Compromise of 1850. So that brings us to an end of our discussion of the crisis of 1850 and the Compromise of 1850. We are still in chapter 14. The next lecture, we're going to look at how we go from seemingly having solved our problems to our problems leading us to secession and the verge of civil war. So now a few questions for you going forward. Okay? The name of the Democratic politician who first proposed the idea of popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty. What is the name of the Democratic politician who first proposed the idea of squatter sovereignty or popular sovereignty? The Whigs elected 2 presidents, and both of them died in office. True or false? The Whigs elected 2 presidents, and both of them died in office. True or false? Question number 3. The omnibus bill was a proposal by Stephen Douglas. True or false? The omnibus bill was a proposal by Stephen Douglas. Okay? True or false? The Compromise of 1850 was passed into law thanks to the efforts of Henry Clay. The Compromise of 1850 was passed into law thanks to the efforts of Henry Clay. And then the last question, gold was discovered in California in 1848, and the next year 100,000 people moved into the state to get rich from the gold fields. Those people were called what? So the people who moved to California to get rich off the discovery of gold were called what? So email those answers to me within the week and look for the next lecture to be posted fairly soon, and we will take ourselves from the success of 1850 to the secession crisis of 1860 and the brink of civil war. And we'll see you then.